Good evening, everyone. We're going to get started. My name is Deborah Archer, and I'm a member of the faculty here at NYU. And as we know, and as we were reminded by the folks on the first panel, slavery is built into the architecture of America, and its legacy and systems of white supremacy continue to permeate American life. But we cannot claim to be a land of equal opportunity until we actually confront that legacy and figure out a way to repair the harm that flows from that legacy. Recently, we've seen an increased discussion, and as we heard from the first panel, not a new discussion, but an increased discussion of reparations proposals ranging from direct cash payments to African Americans to community-based redress to try to remedy the decades and decades of legal segregation and discrimination against Black people and Black communities. And we have tonight an amazing group of panelists that are going to discuss their efforts and other current efforts to advance reparations across the country on a local, state, and federal level. And they're going to talk about how reparations can actually be actualized through shifts in the law and public policy. First, we have Queen Mother Mashariki Jywanza. Queen Mother Jywanza serves as the National Female Co-Chair of the National Coalition of Blacks for Reparations in America. And word on the street is that today is her birthday. So a special congratulations. Sitting next to her, oh, we're gonna sing, go ahead. Birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, Queen Mother. Happy birthday to you. I had to pull back from the microphone during that singing because my voice would have ruined your birthday for you. So I had to let the others do that. And then next to her, we have Professor Joyce Hope Scott. Professor Hope Scott is a clinical professor of African American Studies at Boston University and co-coordinator and investigator of the International Network of Scholars and Activists for African Reparations. And then last but not least, we have David Ragland, and David is the Senior Bayard Rustin Fellow at the Fellowship of Reconciliation, where he directs the campaign for truth and reparations. Thank you all for coming out to join us. I'm hoping we can start with a very broad question to get the conversation going and ask each of you to describe some of the current efforts that you are involved in to secure reparations. We're going to start with you.
I always like to start by giving recognition to my ancestors. We are here because of some tremendous sacrifices that our ancestors gave. So given that, I'd like to mention many of the names that Sister Nkechi mentioned. But as she said, these are names that you should know. Callie House, bless her heart, not too long out of being enslaved, her and Isaiah Dickerson organized over 300,000 ex-slaves to get reparations. Worked hard, and of course, unfortunately, she was put in jail for fraud. She later died. Can you imagine? There were old people that were freed. Think about your parents, your grandparents. They had nowhere to go. They had no money. They had no food. They had nothing. So they were contained in actually concentration camps. Also, Queen Mother Moore, who to the day she died, almost 100 years old, fought for reparations. Sister Njeri Agani, who was a mentor of Queen Mother Moore. Queen Mother Moore told Njeri and myself, don't weary and don't err. Those were some of her words. Brother Hannibal Afrique, who always told us, it didn't matter what you say, it's what you do as to who you truly are. Imari Obadeli, Baba Imari, free the land. 5 states, is what he was organizing around until he died. He fought for reparations and he fought for those 5 states. The Republic of New Africa is still functioning. Queen Mother Dorothy Lewis, who actually brought me into the reparations movement back in 1972. She was in Indianapolis, Indiana, which is where I'm from, and had some T-shirts, "To hell with Baki, reparations now." And I'm like, well, what does this mean? And Sister Dorothy would tell you, she was born in Alaska, y'all. So these are some of the ancestors whose shoulders I stand on. This is why I'm in this movement. I am the female co-chair of NCOBRA. I'm very proud to hold this title because many before me held this title. So I did my libations, and I forgot the question.
The question is to talk about the current efforts that you're engaged in.
NCOBRA, who has been around well over 30 years, our sole purpose is to win reparations for our people. So I would like for you all, if you don't already have it, to write down our website, which is www.ncobraonline.org. So one of a very popular piece that we are doing with our legislative commission is HR 40. And you can go online. We now have an interactive map. You can click your state, and you can tell what representatives have or have not signed on to HR 40. HR 40, of course, was presented by the late John Conyers. He was inspired by Reparations Ray out of Detroit. We also have a Senate bill now that was introduced by Cory Booker. We have more legislators that have signed on ever. I think we're only like 39 short. So what that means, we need you all to click on those maps and call these people and tell them to sign on. Now, is this legislation the only thing that needs to happen? Is it the only strategy that we are dealing with? No, it's not, but it is one. And it's one that we all can participate in. All you got to do is know and understand and believe that we are due reparations. And the reason we are due reparations, I kind of like an interactive thing, so I want to ask you, is kidnapping a crime? Is murder a crime? Is rape a crime? All of this have happened to us. And so our efforts in NCOBRA is to inform our people, to inform the community, educate them. You know, we know the ills. Most of us know them. I hate to keep going over them because it just makes my head hurt because of all of the atrocities that have happened to us as a people. So I probably have said enough. So that's the main thing that I would like for you to take away today in terms of an effort that you can be involved in. It's something each and every one of us can do.
Can you talk a little bit more about what HR 40 and the Senate bill will accomplish and why those things are important for folks who might not be familiar with those pieces of legislation?
Sure. When you go online, you will also find our primer here. And HR 40 started off as a study bill. Let's study the effects of what slavery has done. Well, we have studied enough. And so it has been revised. Sister Nkechi mentioned NARC. NARC worked within NCOBRA. We revised that bill, and before John Conyers died, he sanctioned that. And Sheila Jackson Lee, after Conyers left office, went on and pursued it. So now it's a remedy bill. So we're talking about full repair. And what does that look like? And we need everyone in our community to have input into that. We're a grassroots organization. And so we talk to our people, what does full repair look like? And these are some of the challenges that we are having in terms of coming up with some definitions for that. But people are talking. And I hope when you leave here, you'll talk to some people. And as was stated in the previous panel, there's a lot of repair. The terror that our people have suffered has been handed down from generation to generation. Yesterday's my birthday. I was born in 1950. By the age of 5, I had been called nigger more times than I want to even tell you about in Indianapolis, Indiana. I saw Emmett Till in the jet in 1955. His mother put his picture in there. I never wanted to go south. I was traumatized. I just recently went to Selma, Alabama. I had to apologize to the people there. You all live here, and Mississippi. I never wanted to come. I'm still thinking about Emmett Till.
Professor Hope Scott, can you talk a little bit about the efforts you're engaged with?
Well, first of all, I guess I'll have to say that I was born in the reparations struggle. I suppose I'll have to say that because my family on both sides were involved in founding black settlements and all black towns. So I grew up with that already in my blood, the idea that these were people that were seeking reparative and restorative justice, and they took action into their own hands, as we've heard a lot of already this afternoon. So that idea was something that I've always grown up with. But I think that the notion of talking about my involvement and how I've become really focused from an international perspective, not totally to the exclusion of obviously what happens in the US, but I have to look at it in that perspective and teach my students really what slavery was, because I don't think they actually know what it was. And I don't mean how horrible it was, because they see that on TV sometimes or whatever, and how people were brutalized or tortured. I mean that it was a criminal activity from the very beginning, and that what you have here is theft. Theft, if something is stolen, like the RICO Act, if it's stolen, then it's always out there, and that it needs to be given back or repaid, so it never goes away. That is the fact that what was stolen were people, not slaves. This is the first thing I tell my students and people that I'm talking to. Get the language right, okay? And if we don't define ourselves, as Toni Morrison said, if the oppressor continues to define you, then you'll always being under that definition. We're talking about people like you and me, minding their own business, that were seized and taken away from their homes and so on. That's theft. Okay? It was a criminal activity because there was nothing on the books of England or France or Portugal or Spain or any of those other slave-raiding countries about slavery. They didn't have slavery in their countries. Okay? So it's important internationally because how does the United States, which was not even an entity called the United States, get involved in slavery? And that is via an international route. The real process of American slavery is the domestic slave trade. That's American. The rest of it is international. So in order to fully look at what it means, we have to do that. I mean, we come to slavery via Barbados specifically, okay? And then from Barbados to South Carolina, okay, as payment by King Charles to people who supported him to get back on the throne after the Cromwellian rebellion, and he was ousted for a while. You historians, you're legal scholars, you know that already, okay? But people don't pay attention to that fact. The other thing that came to us, again, thanks to Barbados and the international peace, is the whole idea of chattelization, that you could take the people that you've stolen and chattelize them, transform them from persons into objects. And in that way, you don't have to concern yourself about the fact that they might one day need to slip away and not be property, because you couldn't do that with the white indentured servants and the other people that they tried to use in the beginning, okay? I think that's crucial to understand. So we're talking about people who were dragged over on ships, who were, again, renamed, reassigned an identity, which has remained detrimental to them all their lives. The other piece that's problematic, that helps hinder the progress that we can possibly make around reparations, is that's not the only thing that happened. Because along with chattelization came the invention of race, the white race in particular, and the idea of whites. From that, if you invent a race, white and black, and you commodify the African. So you invent the white race, and you invent the African as a commodity item, which can then not have to be seen as a human creature, and so on. That remains with us. The idea of white supremacy as an institution evolved from the construction of whiteness, and this is an issue. How do you get rid of that? Because if you remove it, then who are the people that live by it? Okay, so it's not so easy to do that. It's interesting that my coming to the work I do now in the international network for scholars and activists for African reparations, which is an international network that came together, that, in other words, a colleague of mine at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland in 2014, we met at a conference, an international conference. Again, it's all international. And she wanted to, her university and the UK government wanted to pull off some kind of conference around reparations. And so we organized an international conference at the University of Edinburgh, at which we had Sir Hilary Beckles and other international folks from not only CARICOM, but all over the world. We had the Herero people of Namibia represented. We had people, the Maori from New Zealand. I mean, people that wanted to support the struggle for African reparations, who had their own struggle. From that, we were able to get a grant from the UK, the Arts and Humanities Research Council, because people at that time said, just how I started out, look, you folks are from the university, and we want to make sure that you have the interests of the people at heart, and so what about the activist community? I mean, you'll go away and you'll write your articles, but what about the people who are in the fields, the grassroots organizations? Well, that is why and how the idea of an international network of scholars and activists for African reparations was born. It is the first of its kind that we've put together. As I said, it was funded by a grant from the Arts and Humanities Research Council of the United Kingdom. And under that grant, we were charged with elaborating the concerns of those people who spoke up at Edinburgh. And they wanted to make sure that we could put together a movement of people fighting for reparations that consisted of the unity between those at the academics as well as the activists. I told them, I don't know what they're talking about. We've always done that here in the United States. Okay, there's no way that any of us who are of African descent here or who are in the university could have turned our backs on the community, because that's where we came from. And if you were like my folks, I was always told, look, don't lose your mind just because you go to a northern university and forget that you have an obligation to your folks. So again, what I learned about that is not the case in the UK. It's not the case in other universities in Europe. And so there is this breach between the academicians and the people in the field who are working. So we wanted to break down that oppositional construct that was useless. We held conferences and symposia first in Brixton, which is where, in the UK, which is when the INOSAR, as we call it, was launched, there with other local organizations, like the UK-based International Social Movement for African Reparations, for example, and other, along with the INOSAR movement, that we formed ourselves. We then had some other conferences at Birmingham, and then again in Senegal at Gorée. And finally, we had the extraordinary conference that we pulled off at Porto Novo in the Republic of Benin in 2018. That was an absolutely extraordinary conference because of people from all over the continent of Africa, as well as from the United States, from Europe, various European nations, even people, as I said before, some people from Australia came, and the Herero people again came to make us aware of their call for reparations from Germany for the genocide committed against those people in Namibia.
Professor Hope Scott, does the organization you're working with have a specific platform or agenda that they're fighting for?
Yes, and to get I'm a professor, so professors are long-winded, as you know, and so they should get right to the point. Okay, so we have principles of participation, and our objectives are essentially, we have objectives. Actually, we have our website, which you can also go to develop a more coherent research agenda for understanding reparations across disciplinary boundaries, and look at the inadequacy of the scholarship around that, improve the recognition of knowledge production partnerships between the scholars and activists, also to provide opportunities for researchers and activists to engage in bilateral knowledge exchange and so on a longer-term basis, to support development of youth and student engagement, involvement in proactively being involved in reparations, to build the inner saw into an organization that can support and provide global legitimacy and visibility to a broad spectrum of viewpoints relative to the reparations debate, to support the struggle for voluntary rematriation or repatriation, as people like to say, for people of African descent from any African country or anywhere of their choice, because if that's what they want, then they should have the right to do that, and they should be granted citizenship, removal of visa requirements, and all of these other kinds of impositions that are colonialistic impositions left for Africans. Also, the outcome of that conference in Porto Novo, which is really, really an extraordinary piece that we want to accomplish, was the creation of what was called the Porto Novo Declaration. The Porto Novo Declaration, which was signed by the traditional kings and the traditional people. We had all levels of the community involved, and it's so important to remember that in African countries, most of them, especially in West Africa, there is still a traditional structure underneath the state structure that's there, vibrant and alive, particularly in a place like Benin, Ghana, and other places like that. Even in those that are predominantly Muslim countries, there is an underlayer of the old rulership that's there, and that's very important and very respected by the local people. So the Porto Novo Declaration called on African nations to speak out in support of those in the diaspora around the world who are agitating and fighting for reparations. At the conference in Durban, and Sir Hilary Beckles pointed this out, the African nations remained silent and did not support the diaspora when it spoke out about the injustices of slavery and about the need for reparations. African nations stayed quiet and sided with their colonial masters. And so what that declaration says, signed by the king, who unfortunately I'm sorry, we can't say passed, he went to Alada, and a great tree fell in the forest recently. But he signed that on behalf of all of the royal kings, the royal heads of the kings of Benin. And there are organizations across the continent. And what they're calling for in that declaration is for African nations to speak up, for governments and for their agents to speak in favor of the people of the diaspora who are agitating for for reparations and restorative justice and so on. We have a report that is available, and I'll make sure that you can get it, that talks about what we've done in this organization for the last 4 years. We're in the process right now of following up by making a documentary in 2 countries. More funding. We've just been really blessed, thanks to my ancestors again, for this blessing to get some money to do the documentary, looking at the sites of the deportation of these captive Africans, of which the former Dahomey, which has now been in, was a central point, and also Ghana. And this is, again, spearheaded by the traditional royalties of those 2 countries. So we're getting ready to do that. And I'm also, we're having a reparations symposium at Boston University on Friday, so day after tomorrow. And I've got all my students involved in that. That is my engagement in reparations, from a child to my profession to what I do in terms of the community, what I do with scholarship, what I teach, and essentially what I believe in. And as I said, it is international. It's more than just what happened here in this country, because it is created from an international impetus, and that's how it comes here. We shouldn't lose sight of that. In that respect, then, it's not about who among descendants of Africans were involved or can trace their lineage back to those enslaved. Essentially, it all turns on the unjust theft, enslavement, chattelization of people just like any of us here who were not slaves already. And so we want to, I'm inviting you, I certainly can't force, to stop saying slaves were brought over. Okay, it was people, captive Africans, men, women, and children, okay, and mostly children, who built this country in the domestic slave trade, who built the cotton industry. I know we see on TV, you know, we see people like Kunta Kinte and the big strong men, which is a horrible thing, that's true. But let's be clear about that. It was children primarily, young people who were marched 1.2 million children were marched across from Virginia, the slave breeding state, to the Mississippi Delta after the Haitians made it possible, because of their War of Independence, for the United States to buy that territory. Children, okay? Keep that in mind. So when you read the book Stolen Childhood, you understand what the scholar is talking about. All right, sure. That is reparable. That is theft of birthright. When you steal somebody's birthright as a child to be a human being, that is restored. That there's payment that's due for that, and not just in money. How do you repair the spiritual damage, the cultural damage, the creation of orphans that this business fostered? You have a country full of black orphan children who don't know who their parents are. That remains today. I talk to my students, who was your grandmother? Well, I know my grandmother, but I can't trace her back any further. Isn't that something wrong with that? How can you say, well, I'm not implicated in this? Okay, even if somebody's a descendant of an African who came of your own free will, you lost an ancestor. Even so, in the trade, okay, because people were being stolen right and left. That's theft. How I define what slavery was and what the nature of reparations is theft that needs to be repaid and restored.
Thank you. David, can you talk a little bit about what the efforts that you're engaged in, your project?
Sure. Good evening. My name is David Ragland, and I'm the Senior Bayard Rustin Fellow at Fellowship of Reconciliation, and it's one of the oldest anti-war human rights organizations in the country. And I come to the conversation about reparations from being born black in this country. But primarily, I was a faculty member at Bucknell in 2014 when Mike Brown was killed. A couple miles from where my parents lived, and I was at home because August 9th is my mom's birthday. It's also my nephew's birthday. And make a long story short, I ended up getting involved in the protests, and with some other organizers, we started a project called the Truth Telling Project. And some of my research had been around restorative justice, truth and reconciliation, and we were thinking about truth and reconciliation, and our community was like, we can do some truth telling, but I don't know about no reconciliation. And we began this project where we had people from our community tell their stories around experiences of police violence. In part, we wanted to have a record, and we also wanted people to be validated in their community, by people of color, Black folk, particularly from their communities or similar communities. And after a little bit, I in particular began really getting annoyed at white folks coming and crying when Black folks tell their stories about being victimized and having relatives murdered by police, in part because I saw how their material conditions remain the same, and our material conditions are what they are. I think a recent study looked at the wealth of Black people in this country, and it's like $8 in comparison to $268,000, right, in Boston. And so at the time, later on, I had become involved with Fellowship of Reconciliation. I was on their national council, and we were talking about reparations, and this was in 2017, for many reasons. We were talking about reparations because as an institution, I don't know if people saw the news about Bayard Rustin, queer Black organizer, who was recently, he was arrested for misogyny and basically arrested for being gay and Black. And FOR gave him the choice, you can either be silent about your identity or you can basically leave. And he left. And so we have this, not just Bayard Rustin, but Martin Luther King was on our national council at one point. So we have this history of, living off of Black and brown folks' movements, and employing white, middle-class folk, right, to work at this organization. And so we were about to sell one of our largest assets, and Max was the interim ED at the time when we launched the campaign. And so we connected and we started learning about reparations and talking with folks like Jumoke Ifeteyo, who's a part of N'Cobra. And 2019 was coming up. And before that year, 2019 was a hell of a year, but it was also a year that we felt, and many of us felt like our ancestors were just talking to us. It was 400 years since Black folk had been brought here. It was 50 years since the Black Manifesto, where James Foreman and others went into Riverside Church and demanded reparations from faith communities. 40 years since the Greensboro Massacre, which led to the first Truth and Reconciliation Commission on American soil. And then 5 years since Ferguson. And we felt that it was a really important moment to be thinking about this campaign rooted in a spiritual approach to reparations. And some of the ways that we framed it is we were thinking about the UN definition of reparations, which looks at reparations in 5 dimensions. And there's restitution, which is a return of what was stolen. rehabilitation or repair of spiritual, physical, and mental health. Satisfaction, which is acknowledgement of guilt, but also the building of memorials and education. And then there's compensation, cut that check, but also guarantees of non-repeat. And for us, that meant don't do that shit no more. How do you not do that shit no more? Decolonization, it is a spiritual practice. We believe that reparations is a spiritual practice. How do we change our behavior? Right? How do we were thinking about, like, if our society could see reparations as a chance to reset, to finally, for once, be accountable for all the things that these amazing speakers have been talking about. What if America was accountable? What would that mean for the international scene? Right? So we see reparations in some ways as a decolonial act or beginning of practices that could shift our entire way of looking at and seeing in the world. And we also thought about it as reparations, not just from the government, but from every white person. Even if you're white and you just got off the boat, you still owe. Not just for slavery, but for slavery in the world that it made. As Sister earlier was saying, Sister Nkechi Taifa was saying. But reparations is owed for slavery in the world that it made. It's not just like lingering. We are living in a world that is a result of theft of land and slavery. And so if we think about reparations from that point of view, what kind of energy do white folks benefit from? There's a correlation between a black person getting stopped by the police and a white person not getting stopped by the police. There's a direct correlation because there are specific policies, right, where police are told to focus on black and brown communities. Even if we look at, like, this subway, the hiring of police, like, they're not just putting those police in the subways over here by NYU. They're putting them in Harlem and the Bronx, where black and brown folks live. There is a direct relationship between your privilege and the injustice that black people experience. And so, you know, we can look at the Center for Investigative Journalism's look into over 1 million mortgages, where they saw that white people were more likely to get a mortgage under the Fair Housing Act than a black person with better credit and more cash on hand. That black people were more likely, according to ProPublica, to be targeted by debt collectors than their white counterparts, right? And the list goes on and on and on. So while the government must pay, when you think about the government paying something, even local governments, who pays most of the taxes, firstly? Who pays the majority share of taxes? People from lower socioeconomic communities, right? So we, in some extent, will be paying ourselves. I still want my check from the government, but white folks owe, right? It is part of a inheritance, and so what we wanted to do is to create a culture of repair. Right? We're not just saying, give me the check. Although some people are saying that, black folks, and I think you should listen to them. But we were looking at reparations from, like, what kind of practices and behaviors could we support and instantiate, especially from a spiritual perspective. So for folks who are familiar with Fellowship of Reconciliation as a faith-based organization, an interfaith organization, we have affiliations like the Jewish Peace Fellowship, the Muslim Peace Fellowship, the Episcopal, and the list goes on and on. And we worked with a number of our affiliates because we, with the help of NCOBRA, established two dates called Reparations Sunday, #Reparations Sunday. And we provided materials for faith communities to think about reparations on 2 designated Sundays out of the year. And then we gave them or began a period of preparation. So for instance, the first Reparations Sunday was August the 14th. And we began on Juneteenth with a period of preparation so that faith-based communities could begin on June 19th, which is Juneteenth, designated as the day that we look at Black folks who have been freed, particularly in Galveston, Texas, from slavery, and that's also connected to Field Order 15. But on June 19th, churches, synagogues, a number of communities, faith communities around the country had services. And we asked them to begin what we call reparative relationships with Black-led grassroots organizations. We want to tell people how they should be making repair, but we wanted it to be Black-led. We also wanted it to be something that would think about and utilize this kind of holistic approach and understanding to reparations. And so I think part of this kind of spiritual approach was thinking about ourselves and thinking about our loss. Like when we talk about restitution, we're not just talking about theft of property. We're talking about theft of spirituality, right? Theft of religion and identities, which often contain so much of people's culture. And so I think that the notion of reparations from the government is urgently important because governments have to, right, be accountable. If the US government was accountable, I think that would impact so much of the world. But also individual white folks should be thinking about what do I owe? But also thinking about this notion of guarantees of non-repeat. How do I not repeat this? And I'm not just talking about like, I'm not gonna stare when Black people come into the room. Or, you know, I'm gonna do A, B, and C, but like, what are you invested in? Right, seriously, like when you think about guarantees of non-repeat, you have to also think about how many systems are complicit in injustice against Black folk and how that's connected, right? So one CEO sits on the board of another company, and that company has suppliers of companies that not only house children in cages, but build mattresses for Black boys and girls in jails. And that stuff is rife throughout our portfolios. Like at one point, someone donated Nestle stock as a gift to Fellowship of Reconciliation. And some of my close organizing friends are with We the People of Detroit and from Flint, Michigan, and we know that Nestle is doing more than taking its fair share of water so that and then Black folk in Detroit can't drink and have access to water. How are we complicit in systems that recreate and reinforce the system and the world that slavery created? And so as a spiritual practice, we ask people, think about and begin unraveling yourself from that.
Thank you. So you all were incredibly helpful and powerful in explaining some of the components of reparations that address economic, spiritual, and cultural challenges, the restitution, rehabilitation, satisfaction. you want your check for sure, but also that every white person should figure out how they can also contribute and be held accountable. I'm wondering if there are models that we should be focused on and that we should be aware of that are trying to implement portions of this, that are starting that process of cultural repair. What should, tangibly, what does that look like? David, you're shaking your head.
The first group that popped in my head was Soulfire Farm, and it's a group of Leah Penniman and her husband are the owner, and they, number one, have been educating black farmers. As you know, that the amount of land, and particularly black farms, over the last 60 years decreased to lower than about 2% at this point, from around 12%, and that was just in about a decade of black people being freed from slavery and then building and saving and buying land, and it was lost through theft of white neighbors, but also through very nasty policies from the U.S. Department of Ag. There was recently one of the largest settlements that came out of this whole behavior by the Department of Ag, which denied people land and farm loans and support for all of that for generations. And some of the work that they're doing is educating black farmers, and they have a reparations map, and they are also doing very innovative things like creating land easement for indigenous groups who formerly lived on the land where they're at. So they're looking at how do we cooperate, because there's a lot of controversy over that, but how do we cooperate? And then there's a number. I'll stop there.
You were, just to ask you a follow-up question as you're about to speak, you mentioned in the beginning the slogan "To hell with Baki," and I wonder how much we should be thinking about policies like affirmative action as reparations.
I think the previous panel kind of handled that. That is not reparations, not at all. What I was getting ready to say is to give credit to the group that David is working on, because Reparations Sunday, if we can spread that throughout the country, is a very good way of giving back. Many people go to church, synagogues, and it is an excellent way of giving back. And I think David and them have created a good model with that. I also want to talk about black farmers. Black farmers are organizing, but they're still losing their land.
Yep.
They are still losing their land, and so they need our support. We have a black farmer, Joyce was talking about settlements. We have a black settlement in Indianapolis called Lyle Station. And the original people from Lyle Station are still trying to hold on to their land. And the brother went to the bank and said, "I need a new tractor." And they said, "Oh, okay, fine. Give us 1.5 acres of your land." And he was like, "No, let me find another way to do this." And so they are trying to organize to keep their land. Land is important. And land is one of the components that is a part of a reparations package. I have no problem with a check. I know everybody gets all upset. What you gonna do with the money? Ain't none of your business what I do with the money. It's old. It's old. But there's other things in terms of institution building. Ed Whitfield speaks about liberation zones, where we actually will create within our community those things that we need. We have a brother in New Jersey, Brother Onaje, who's working on our health commission, and he's talking about having health centers that can deal with mental health and physical health to service our people. Whether we ever get a dime, we've got to heal ourselves. Mm-hmm. And we understand that. And we're trying to get organizations and individuals who are working on projects that can directly help our communities to come together. We've got to stop fighting each other. My husband talks about all the time that the road to reparations might be a 10-lane highway, and you might be in your lane, but the end result is reparations. So, let's not worry about whether I'm in your lane or you in my lane. Let's move forward. And so that's more important than anything. And as a people, we've had difficulty with that because of all that we have gone through and all that has been put on us. We don't really identify the fact that we're one people, but we are. The sister was talking about, they took Africans from Africa. They didn't take slaves from Africa. And while I'm on this, let me dispel this myth. Were there collaborators in Africa? Yep. Do we have collaborators today? Yep. Were the majority of the people collaborators? No. That's right. As we talk about the millions of people that were killed, millions of people died on the continent of Africa to keep us there. There's several festivals that go on. When I go to Ghana quite a bit, which is where I was installed as a Queen Mother, and in the northern part, there's a group there that has a ceremony every year because they fought back the British. They kept their people. So one thing that we all can do is educate ourselves and not buy into the myths that people put out here about us. Because as you internalize those myths, you begin to think yourself, well, maybe it's not due. Oh, maybe they'll take that money and go buy 2 or 3 cars. Ain't none of your business.
Professor, would you like to?
Well, your question was about what is being done.
Or what are the models for
the
implementing
models.
these core principles that you all discussed that should be a part of reparations?
One of the things that the people proposed in Benin from that conference was what they called a memorial, to build a memorial. Actually, the conference was held in a, I'm sorry. The conference was held in a museum which was established by an Afro-Brazilian man who came back to Dahomey after being taken away. And he already started this tree, what he calls a family tree. It's an extraordinary thing. They wanted to put a wall of remembrance there with all of the people who had contributed to the liberation struggle, Africans as well as people from the diaspora. Actually, this idea of repair at the spiritual and cultural reconnection level, the idea there is that we, as the people who were abused and separated from our families, we need to heal, and that healing is something that, as my brother was saying here, is something that we have to do ourselves. And so that was one of the things that came along. The idea of decolonizing the mind, as Jywanza points out, is the most important of all, as they pointed out. And how do you do that? How can you revise the education system to that people will look at what they have and appreciate it? There's actually a conference that's going to be happening in the Gambia, in Banjul, in May, that will deal with that very issue, the Africa we want, it's international Pan-Africanism and the Africa and African people that we want. So there are a lot of things going on at the level of the people themselves to unify and to reconnect to that spiritual and to try to repair that breach, family breach, I might say, that took place way back so long ago. And I agree that is really where we have to start. We have to start healing ourselves first and foremost, because even if I ask myself, I'm with you, my sister, yeah, if somebody's going to give me a child, I'll take it. I'll find something good to do with it or whatever. But the point is that how can we move forward and know what we need to do if we're confused about who we are? We should keep in mind that this is the decade of African people, that the United Nations declared this, the decade of African people. It's going to be over in 2024. I always ask the question, what will we have left at the end of this decade? Okay, I think that is for us, people like us right here in this room today, to determine what we can do. What's going to come out of this conference, this gathering today? How will that be a statement for repair, for next steps? What will be our next steps? It's certainly a marvelous idea right here, the idea that at a place like in NYU, that the School of Law would launch something of this nature. I mean, there are people who are doing things individually too. I think of Katrina Brown, what she did with her family in the documentary Traces of the Trade. She made them all come together, sit down, and face the fact, look, this is what we did. This is how we got our money. And as a result of that, a lot of really helpful programs at Brown have taken place. As a result of white students really checking into the history of Harvard Law School, they realized, look, Isaac Royal was the owner of Belinda Sutton Royal, or Belinda Royal Sutton, who launched her appeal to the Massachusetts Supreme Court in 1783. And so the little, seemed like bundles of hay, they thought, and no bundles of hay in Antigua, it's bundles of sugar cane. So they've taken his name down, anything related to Isaac Royal, connected to the Harvard School of Law. It's happening, the University of Glasgow, for example, has acknowledged finally, I mean, and the Scots got most of the reparation money that the previous panel was talking about. In terms of reparations and people who got repair, white people who got it, the Scots got more than anybody else. They know that. They're recognizing it. I'm not trying to give them any perks because they don't actually need any. They don't deserve any. But the idea that the Glasgow is saying, okay, next is Liverpool, and they're all trying to outdo each other by acknowledging right now that this is something. It's happening here at some of our universities as well. And students are at the forefront of this. I think that that's where the movement and that's where the transformation, genuine transformation, will take place of the young. I talked earlier about my preoccupation with the children who are the victims of this whole business of theft. And I think that that is a crucial point that we have to rely on as well. Can we enlighten them to what it really was so that it's not a movie event? Then they can understand this is really something that could have related to me. I could have been involved in this, whether white or black, okay? And I think that this is a part of what we're trying to do with the unity of scholars and activists with the continents, on the continent of Africa, as well as in the diaspora. This is the idea of the kind of transformation that I think that I'm pushing with our efforts here with the International Network of Scholars and Activists. And I think that those of us who work with young people, those of you who are young people here at the law school, for example, this is the place to begin. And there are some models, and there have always been some models, even during slavery, of whites and other well-meaning people who did something on their own accord to help try to change the situation.
Let me mention one more thing as we're talking about models. I had mentioned Brother Hannibal Afrique, and he had proposed that we look at taking our tax dollars and having everybody who pays taxes to put a percentage that would go into a trust fund that we would use to help our communities with affordable housing, with the health issues. And, you know, whether you know it or not, we're helping pay reparations for the Japanese. Anybody who pays taxes, that's what you're doing. And so when Brother Hannibal came up with that, I was like, wow, okay. So, you know, that's a model that we can use. And then I want to say briefly, we have always had people outside of our communities that has helped us. The majority of people during the enslavement period, the majority of European people were not slave owners. I would say the majority of them didn't even condone slavery. But guess what? They never said a mumbling word. Never. There were a few that did, but the majority of them never happened. When you look at these pictures of lynchings and the thousands of people who came out with their picnics to watch them, where are those people? Where's the descendants of those people? They're among us. Yes, they are. In Indiana, one of the last hangings was in Marion, Indiana, and a brother escaped. Luckily, I got a chance to meet him in Milwaukee. My children got a chance to meet him. And they did a play about it. My husband and I went to the play, and then they said, well, let's have a discussion after the play. This lady, I don't know why she did it. Well, you know, I think my grandmother took my aunt and my uncle to that lynching. The whole audience went, ah. And she said, no, she's not racist. It was a historical event. Wow. So, you know, and I just make this point that, you know, we have more power than we think we have. You know, they're always saying, if you see something, say something. You know, that's for something else. But, you know, again, use the power of the pen, the internet. There's so many things that we can do. I see so much nonsense on the internet from all kinds of people. And we can use that energy to aid our fellow citizens. We can do that. You know, many of you are law students, which means some of you are going to be politicians. What are you going to do when you get in office? You're hearing this information. What are you going to do with it? You know, maybe you're here because your professor told you to be here. I'm not sure. But, I mean, I put a challenge to you. You know, if we don't change this world, number one, we're not going to have one. I don't care if you're Republican, Democrat, Independent, Socialist. I don't care what you are. Just be a decent person and help us save the world. Okay, I'll get off my soapbox.
Thank you.
Can I just want to add, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, you should go ahead, because I was going to wrap up, so I'm going to go ahead and let you.
I was just going to add 3 groups, Boston, Ujima, and what you remember I was talking about divesting from injustice. You can actually invest and get a return. And they support Black-led organizations that provide services around the city of Boston. And then Jubilee Justice, it has a farm fund that funds Black farmers. And then there's this website called Reparations for Slavery. And the person who started it realized that she was a descendant of slave owners and began making reparations herself, negotiating with people. As she realized that she had governors in her family, doctors, lawyers, and so she started paying for descendants of those slaves' education. So I think that, you know, there's so many things like Queen Mother Mashariki was saying that we should all do and we have a part in.
So an hour goes by really fast, and our hour is done. I want to thank you all sincerely for participating in the conversation.